environmental governance, their ESG record, and how it affects their operations. Some larger organizations even fill out the Carbon Disclosure Project's 161-page questionnaire. And this information is usually intended for investors, so people can decide, is this company sustainable? Is this someone we want to invest in? And companies are not liable for their statements in these voluntary disclosures. But this new proposed mandatory global baseline, this link to financial statements, is being crafted by the International Sustainability Standards Board. If governments adopt the standard, then banks, insurers, and investors will eventually mandate this information from every company. The European Union has recently passed legislation, just I think last week, to do this, and they're phasing it in over a few years. The European Union worked with the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, when crafting this new standard to ensure that they were aligned. Beginning in fiscal year 2024 in the European Union, companies with more than 500 employees will be mandated to do this sustainability disclosure with their financial accounts. Each subsequent year, the bar drops lower for the size of company that will be mandated to include this information. They're starting with the big companies, first of all, because they have probably the revenue to pay for it, because it's very expensive. And there's also an assumption in the European Union government that they will trickle it down to their supply chain. And so they will be getting the supply chain accustomed to acquiring this information, reporting this information to the larger corporation, until eventually they have to do it all themselves. So today I would like to share with you what's coming down the pipeline for Canada and why you should care and what can be done about it. So how did this start? What exactly is the ISSB? Well, last year at COP26 in Glasgow, that's the big climate change meeting, the International Sustainability Standards Board was created, and it was created within the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. The IFRS has been around since about the year 2000, and they have a really good reputation for creating these standardized accounting standards for the world. I think 165 countries use the IFRS standards. Canada is one of them. So the ISSB was created to establish a new global baseline, a new global language for sustainability and climate-related financial disclosures, or ESG. It has 13 board members from different countries around the world. Canada lobbied for and received an ISSB office in Montreal, which opened in June, and it's established a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to work in lockstep with the ISSB in order to implement this in Canada. They're currently recruiting board members. They will appoint 12 board members. The applications close in January, and I encourage people who are on this call to put their name in the hat. The ISSB also has a jurisdictional working group with representatives from the European Union, the United States Securities Exchange Commission, the UK, Japan, and China. And they consult with each other on a monthly basis in order to ensure alignment of what the ISSB is doing with various national standards that will be put forward. So the other thing that the ISSB has is a partnership framework. And the partnership framework includes the big four accounting firms, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, PwC. Also, the Global Reporting Initiative has been subsumed into the ISSB. The Carbon Disclosure Project, a number of UN groups, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Bank. So they bringing all the major financial institutions on board to ensure that this could be implemented around the world. So what exactly is the new global baseline? Well, within 4 months of being created in March 2022, the ISSB released 2 draft documents for comment, and it was open until the end of July. There was the general sustainability related financial disclosures and a climate related financial disclosure. And the climate one included industry-based metrics for 68 different industries. So it would be entirely across the economy. These are the first 2 of a planned set of 5. So the remaining 3 that they'll be bringing out in the new year deal with general environment, social issues, and governance issues. It's intended to be building blocks so that they can build up on these different things. Now, since the comment period was closed, the ISSB has been holding meetings, either in Frankfurt or Montreal. And at one of these meetings, the chair, Emmanuel Faber, commented that normally this type of standard setting takes between 7 and 10 years. There's a lot of negotiation. There's comments between different jurisdictions. There's rounds of stakeholder feedback and so on. But they're planning to do this in a year. There's only been one set of stakeholder feedback, and that was what ended in July. So they're moving rather quickly on this, and you have to kind of ask why. They voted unanimously to support the requirement of mandatory Scope 3 emissions accounting, covering the entire 15 categories of the GHG protocol value chain. That means all direct and indirect emissions that can be linked to an entity across the supply chain, upstream, downstream, from the making of a product to how it's transported, to how it's used, how it's disposed of after purchase. Basically, everything anybody does has to be accounted for by a company that produces something. The chair of the ISSB, Emmanuel Faber, was emphatic that all emissions must be counted from everyone along the value chain. This was the most important element of it all. So currently companies will definitely report their Scope 1 because they can control that, they know what it is. Some also include Scope 2 because that's the emissions from the energy that they're receiving from a utility or something. And some even estimate their Scope 3 emissions, or only certain of the 15 categories. But they want to mandate all 15. Now, in the first year, they said, well, maybe we'll just have about 5 or 6 that companies will have to do, with the understanding that eventually they'll have to report all 15. So the ISSB recommended that companies can estimate. They don't have to be really super specific with the Scope 3 emissions. Don't worry so much about tracking use and disposal right now, but the method of estimation will need to be approved. It's not even clear how you go about doing that, and they admitted that in the discussions. We're not really sure how we can quantify Scope 3, but we're asking companies to estimate it anyway. Now, of course, this opens up questions of liability and whatnot, because if it's linked to your financial statement, there's certain legal requirements about the accuracy of the information you're representing. So the other issue is that they want all emissions data to have third-party verification. Well, how much is that going to cost? How do you verify that? They also agreed to mandate the use of climate scenario analysis to assess ongoing and future climate risks for businesses. How much is that going to cost? The implications for businesses, particularly small, medium enterprises and those companies in the resource sector, it's staggering. For an example, an AEG member, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, they declared on its Carbon Disclosure Project questionnaire that in terms of staff time, software, consulting services, and third-party verification of their reported emissions, the cost was $750,000. That's a big company. So I can't imagine what the estimates would be for a smaller company to have to undertake all of this reporting. It will take so much time. So if you're a small operation with maybe 5 or 10 employees, how are you going to report on all of these things, and what's it going to cost? Because chances are you'll have to hire a specialist to do it, because a lot of this is specialist information that, not just, it's very difficult for an average person to do. Now, the Carbon Disclosure Project announced at COP27 in Egypt that they would use the ISSB Global Baseline as their voluntary questionnaire beginning in 2024. So whatever countries don't adopt the ISSB right away, but use the Carbon Disclosure Project voluntary questionnaire, they will be exposed to what the ISSB wants anyway. So it's a way to sort of bring it into those who would voluntarily comply, but aren't part of the mandatory elements yet. Now, all of this information is intended for banks, insurers, and investors who will have to account for the amount of absolute emissions on their books. And this was one of the requirements for those who joined the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. If you look at the pledge, what they've pledged to do, they've pledged to reduce till zero the absolute emissions on their books. Not net emissions, but their absolute emissions. So, you know, you could look at it this way. Banks will no longer care if you're a credit risk. They're going to care if you're an emissions risk. And so carbon emissions becomes the new currency. So unfortunately, many accounting and legal firms, and the CPA Canada just had an article today singing the virtues of this. They like the idea of a globally consistent accounting metric because they erroneously believe, in my opinion, that this will simplify matters and make ESG more transparent. But they also understand this will generate a tremendous amount of work for accountants, for auditors, for lawyers. And I've spoken with some accountants who have suggested this new standard ought to be welcomed because it'll help prevent greenwashing, and that some companies already report a lot of this information anyway, so it's no big deal. Now, a simplification of reporting and a sense of standardization so there's consistency, that's an agreeable and noble goal. But of course, accounting departments stand to gain from this new process, and they'll have to see an expansion of personnel in order to carry out this work. However, the critique of ESG reporting, particularly like that made by Elon Musk and the accusations of so-called greenwashing by activist groups, it's rooted actually in the various ranking and rating systems out there that provide drastically different ratings because there's no consistent weighting of the data or weighting of the metrics. So there's also an issue here with the bundling of companies in ESG funds. But it's not the nature of the data that's the problem. It's how they're bundling things. It's how it's being rated, the sort of metrics that they're using. Why do they rank one metric higher than another? Therefore, it's unlikely that this data is going to solve that problem. All it does is create more data, but it doesn't change how people actually evaluate or consider that data. Now, the second set of assumptions is also not quite correct. There are a number of new mandatory requirements that are not in the existing ESG reports, and key information currently highlighted in someone's sustainability report, such as carbon offsets or carbon capture and storage or emissions intensity reduction and so on, that's absent from this. All they care about is what your gross emissions are. They have a separate place buried in the document on where you can report your carbon offsets or whatnot, but it's not beside, you can't say what your net emissions are. They only care about what your gross emissions are. So it's not even presented with equal prominence. So companies might do a lot of investment with carbon offsets, carbon storage, and so on, and that's not counted in the same way as their gross emissions. And furthermore, a company's not liable currently for what they say in their ESG reports. But this proposed new standard will be linked with a company's financial statement with related legal implications, as I mentioned before. Now, I have a high and deep respect for accountants. I have some in my family, but an accountant tends to focus on the numbers, on the specific data, on quantification, on reporting. And sometimes missing from an accountant's perspective are the implications of what of requiring or omitting certain data actually will do. And so that's one of the devil in the details of this proposed new global language. Which brings us to why should you care? Well, Canada has not yet implemented this global standard, even though we're on the trajectory to do so. And when a country implements it, they don't necessarily have to take all of it. They can say, well, in our particular jurisdiction, this particular element of that standard isn't applicable. So there's room for maneuver for Canada to say, you know what, maybe scope 3 emissions should just be voluntary. Or, you know, maybe not yet, we don't want that. And, you know, climate scenario analysis is kind of a burden for many companies. So maybe we won't require that right now. But if a company wishes to do it, they could. So there's some ability there to be flexible and to influence changes. So there's a narrow window right now to influence what's actually going to be implemented. I'm not saying this can be stopped. I don't think it can, unless there's some kind of sudden change in Ottawa. But this will likely begin to be implemented in Canada in fiscal year 2024. The costs of compliance are significant and burdensome and crippling for smaller companies. This will transform how businesses operate because they will be forced to monitor the emissions profile of every element of their operations, including how their employees get to work, how much energy each employee uses in their everyday thing. They will also have to make predictions about future climate changes and potential regulatory changes and how those things may affect their business. And this is all being done in an extremely hasty way. And as I mentioned before, normally these types of standards take 7 to 10 years. There's lots of consultation, but this is going to be done within a year. Which brings us to actions. What can we do about this? Well, I think the first and most important thing is to talk about it, because very few people even know this is going on and that it's going to be coming in. So people within certain accounting circles and certain financial circles, they see this coming, but most people don't. So talking about it at every opportunity where it can be worked into a conversation, like, have you heard about this ISSB thing that Canada's planning on doing? This is super important because the more people know about it, it plants the seeds for awareness of what's coming. To say that it's costly, it's burdensome, it's invasive, it's being rushed through. Maybe we should slow down the pace a little. Maybe Canada needs a little more consultation, especially with their significant resource industries that could be crippled by this, for talking to the agriculture industry, because they too will be significantly affected by these changes in the industry related things. So more discussion and consultation needs to be done. Maybe a real cost benefit analysis would be useful. But until people talk about it, they don't even know this is happening. So my request would be, please talk about it to whoever you can, as often as you can. This is kind of how Mark Carney got everybody into the idea of doing ESG in the first place. He talked about it all the time to whoever who would listen in every interview. He would just start talking about how if you don't start moving now, you're going to be left behind and you'll have stranded assets. And that was 7 years ago. So it takes time to build this up, and we don't have that much time, but I would say talking about it's really important. The second thing I would suggest is to encourage local Alberta accounting and financial services groups to resist the more controversial elements. So speaking up to the Financial Reporting and Insurance Standards Canada, FRAS, they could counsel more consultation and consideration before implementation. So these standards have been hastily put together and omit key considerations like there's no place for energy security, there's no place for food security, there's no place about having a politically stable government. None of that is in these standards. And the third thing might be to encourage the Alberta Securities Commission to pressure the Canadian securities administrators to minimize the impacts on Alberta's small medium enterprises. First of all, by suggesting don't make Scope 3 mandatory, don't make the industry-based requirements mandatory, and don't mandate scenario analysis. Those are truly the most crippling things in all of this. The fourth thing I would recommend is to innovate and cooperate. One option might be to create industry-based inventories of emissions, and that would spread the burden of tracking and accounting of emissions to pool resources for scenario analysis. One example is the INSERVA, formerly PSAC, ESG playbook. So they're trying to create an emissions and ESG playbook that their members can access so they will know what kinds of emissions are on average for their industry, which allows them to do it in a more cost-effective way. The fifth thing would be to volunteer. Put your name in the ring for becoming a member of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. I think they need people who have realistic expectations and and understand the implications of what this will do for us. And they're accepting nominations until the beginning of January 2023. And the last thing I would say is to contact your MLA, your MP, the Premier's office, the Alberta Department of Environment, the Alberta ESG Secretariat, or all of the above, and ask for action. Because I don't even know if they know what's going on. And so make suggestions. This might include, you know what, maybe the province should develop its own Scope 3 emissions estimates that all companies can use. And then that would sort of remove the liability from companies from maybe misreporting because they're doing estimates, and say, you know what, the province is going to do it. We've had it verified. This is something that all of our industries can use, all our businesses can use. The government can also mandate through legislation that the tracking of individuals' carbon emissions is banned, that you can only do aggregate emissions, that you can't pinpoint what an individual's emissions profile is, because that's coming. And that you can't use Scope 3 emissions to discriminate against a company's or an individual's in a bank's, insurers, or investors' decision. Because in GFANs, they've committed to reducing their gross emissions on their books. So at some point, they're going to have to start cutting if people can't bring their numbers down. And so then if they don't take into account what they're doing for carbon capture and only looking at what their absolute emissions are, suddenly the bank's just going to close the account or say, I'm sorry, we can't invest with you, or we have to cut somewhere. So that's a possibility. Ask the government to create a realistic climate scenario analysis that businesses can use for free. That would be, I think, really useful. There's a couple of different ways to do that. And if the government gets word of it, then that can be helpful. What I heard I listened to hours and hours of the ISSB meetings, and what they fear the most is industry coming up with their own climate scenario analysis. They want them to use the ones from the IEA. They want them to use the IPCC ones. They want the ones that Greenpeace have made or the WWF have made, but they don't want industry to come up with their own. So the province could commission their own that then companies could use for free. That's a possibility if they're going to persist and make this mandatory. And then the last thing that a government could do that you could pressure them to do would be to have a carbon credit certification registry. And that would be to ensure that the carbon capture, utilization, offset credits generated in this province could be used by companies operating in the province. Because they're saying that only third-party verified, government-approved carbon offsets can be even mentioned in these reports. So if the province develops their own, then that allows Albertan companies that are doing this to actually get credit for it. So these are some actions that can be explored to try and mitigate the worst of this new global baseline of sustainability financial accounting. But the issue is really flying under the radar. And until more people hear about it, there'll be little incentive to change it. So please speak out and lobby your government to maybe make some of these changes. Thank you.
Awesome, Tammy. Thank you. Thank you. I believe we have time for some Q&A. Our lunch has been delivered into the room, so we will let everyone in the room start eating, and then we'll have some private time with Tammy later. In the meantime, for those of you on Zoom, if you have questions, please put your hand up, and then we'll unmute. You can say your name, the company you're representing, and then the question for Tammy. Go ahead, Pete. Pete LaFontaine.
This was great.
Oh,
Very good.
Sorry, hang on.
1 second.
We're not. Oh, that is probably.
Can you hear me now?
1 second, Pete. Okay, can we hear you now? Go
I
ahead.
don't know. Can you hear me now?
No, 1 second.
It's not on my end.
Try again, Pete. Go now.
How about now?
Perfect.
I want some of those sandwiches. No, I'm kidding. This has been awesome, Tammy. Very good disclosure to this important subject, and I think you're right. We have to have a lot of communications around it. Who in Ottawa would you say is the primary champion of this is my first question. And the second question is, how many countries are actually agreeing to this versus the ones that have been kind of voluntarily running into this or doing this?
That's a good question. Thank you. So for Ottawa, I would suggest Leslyn Lewis because she's paying more attention to these sort of international developments. I would still probably contact Pierre Polyev. I know he's busy, but it's an important issue, clearly, and whoever your local MP is, but those two in particular. As for other countries, so one of the important reasons why they had this jurisdictional working group was so that they could incorporate what they're doing to the big movers, who they really want to target, which is the United States, Japan, China, the EU, the UK. The UK already has said that it's mandatory for certain size companies to follow the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, the TCFD program stuff. But the UK is looking to implement the ISSB recommendations. So whenever their standard comes out, the UK has said that they will likely implement it. The EU, as I mentioned, their new one is pretty much the ISSB stuff with more. So they add double materiality, they add more restrictions for how companies have to report, and they're phasing it in. But they produced this really great document that compared what they're doing and what the ISSB doing, and on almost every box you tick, it's the same thing. Japan has said they would like to implement this. There was a lot of comments from the Japanese economy. China's on the fence; they're not sure, but they've got, I think, 2 members on the ISSB board. So China could be, but they're really trying to get African countries and Asian countries involved, but it's unclear at this moment precisely how many will be doing it. Canada has signaled that we will adopt this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Anybody else? A question on practicality of Canadian-based standards, either industry or otherwise.
Hello, everyone. My name's Todd Deere. I'm with the Triad Group. We're based in Calgary, and we represent oil and gas upstream producers. And we've had several people speak to us about the need for ESG or their understanding of ESG or the direction of ESG. So back to what you said, and thank you, Doctor, so much for your information today. I appreciate you paying attention to this. What do you think, honestly, practically, is the possibility of getting a Canadian-based framework or standard organization going to compete with this, either industry-based or Indigenous-based or otherwise? Is there some way that we can generate a Made in Canada solution from a stakeholder or grassroots level that fits better than what is trying to be imposed upon us?
That's an excellent question. It's a problem because of the hastiness of this, right? I mean, it's moving very quickly, and I don't know what it would take to do a Canadian style set of standards in 12 months. I mean,
Right.
there's so much negotiation, especially if you had an Indigenous style one or, certain industry-based ones. I think it's incredibly difficult, especially at this point. I don't know if it's possible to suggest to the government that why don't we hold off on this while we do our own Made in Canada version? Because it seems that Ottawa is extremely committed to this, giving, I think it's something like $3 million a year towards operating the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board in Montreal. So they've put a lot of money into it, and there was a large group of stakeholders, including CAP and some other ones, that supported opening up the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. So, I mean, there's a possibility there, but no one's even talking about it. So I'm not sure, given the pace that they're moving.
Thank you. I think I agree with what you say. This is moving so quick, and they're trying to replace a whole bunch of, you know, invented and voluntary standards with something that has the trappings of formality. But do you have any information or any comment? Is there any wedge that can be driven here on the Indigenous angle, i.e. UN policies? Is everything that you have read congruent in terms of establishing this framework and yet disregarding perhaps Indigenous concerns that are at the same time being raised by the UN? You know, is that the angle upon which we ask for greater consideration?
So that's a good question, because these are the first two, and the next three that they're supposed to be rolling out later next year for comment is the governance one and the social one, which will include reference to Indigenous peoples. So they're already working on incorporating the Indigenous angle into what their global baseline is going to be, but they're just really eager to get the climate stuff first, because they want to shift the investment out of hydrocarbons and over to renewable industries. And they see this as a mechanism to do so. So maybe we could say, look, maybe we should wait until they've got these other things going and we can understand more how this is going to impact our First Nations and their aspirations to be developing resources to create prosperity for their people. Maybe we should just hold off on that. That could be a good wedge.
I think you're wonderful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Well,
Anyone else? Oh, go ahead,
well,
Pete.
Will a copy of this be shared?
Yes, if Tammy allows it, yes.
I think that would be awesome to be able to go through it and then maybe add some value to what you've put in there. Like, I'd love to see, first of all, like the whole GHG emissions and the climate emergency aspects that have come from COP and the rest of it. I mean, that's really got to be, that if that's at the highest level of this thing, that's something we definitely got to take into consideration. There's been a lot of changes and new information that some of these emergency acts are starting to cause massive devastation around the planet in terms of people's lives and safety and food safety and all that sort of stuff. So something's gonna, I think, brew to the top here soon, I hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Pete. Anybody else in closing? We'll have one more question.
I have one.
Okay, Marissa, go ahead.
Thank you, Catherine. I think it was very informative, very educational. So you mentioned that they had noted that for the level 3 that they would take estimates, just encourage companies to kind of look at the estimates. Globally, is there any kind of set range that's been adopted or accepted for the level of what that estimation is? Like, are individuals kind of expecting 5, 10, 15, 20%, or, you know, 50%? Is there any standard range in there? And then it's a secondary to that, you also mentioned that they would have to approve the calculations. Would that be the ISSB, like the board itself, or have they talked about how or who is actually going to own or control how that's accepted?
Those are great questions. I'll answer the second one first. So in the discussions, they said, look, it's really important that we have third-party verification, but we're not going to tell them who should do it, but they have to be credible, and which just leaves it open, right? So depending on and they did that, I think, because there's different jurisdictions that have different groups doing these things. So they didn't want to specify an American one because the Chinese wouldn't use it. So they just left it open. And so as long as it's an authority, however that's defined, acceptable to a particular national or regional jurisdiction that has some kind of accreditation, then that would be permissible for third-party verification. In your first question, if I can remember,
just the range, the range of acceptability in the estimations.
I don't know. It seems to be that it's a nascent industry where people can provide some kind of estimates. Now, I know that Unilever, for example, they employ a certain group to calculate their scope 3 emissions estimates. And I think many energy companies do the same thing. But again, it's not, the metric to do so isn't standardized. So once again, they're putting forward something, you can use an estimate. And then where does that leave a company if, let's say, they get challenged by an environmental group who does some kind of verification on their thing saying, well, you misused this, or you miscalculated and you should have used this one or something. So that can open things up to litigation. And I hate to say it, but the environmental groups have a huge war chest for litigation. They're just waiting. They're waiting for this mandatory stuff to litigate companies. So that's another option. Do we set up something that, like I mentioned with the provincial government, that they have a specific scope 3 estimate? Either they have an inventory or they certify a particular type of calculation for it. So then companies can't be held liable for misestimating or something. Thank you for those questions.
Thanks, Catherine.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining today. We will send out a copy of this presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free to send me an email and I will introduce you to Tammy directly so that you can contact directly. Thank you again. We're going to get back to our Italian food. Sorry to make you jealous. All right,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
for
guys.
your time.
Thank you.